Today I'm here to talk to you about a story from my childhood, actually. When I was 7 years old, my family was living in Iowa, and my father came home one evening and he made an announcement that we were going to be moving to California and we were going to be traveling by wagon train. He said it would be like a 6-month-long camping trip. Now, of course, the children were excited and my mother was horrified. And we began many months of preparation for this 6-month-long wagon train journey across the country. We had to sew our clothing and knit socks and make quilts and blankets. And Father built the wagon, and then we began the process of packing and buying supplies and deciding what we absolutely had to take and what we could afford to leave behind. And that was a wrenching process for my mother. And in April of 1860, I was 7 years old, and we set out from our home in eastern Iowa to Council Bluffs, which was our jumping off place. That's where we were going to meet the rest of the wagons in our train. There were 75 altogether, and we would start our grand 6-month-long camping trip. Now, if any of you have traveled long distances with small children, I'll ask you to keep any complaints that you had about your own journeys in mind as I talk. Every day we would travel 10 to 15 miles, and we walked most of the way because it was more comfortable and because it saved the animals. Each wagon weighed about 3,000 pounds. It had all of our household goods, all the cooking supplies, flour and cornmeal and lard and you name it, gunpowder, 50 pounds of gunpowder. So each wagon was very, very heavy. And in order to save the animals, we walked. Some days 10 to 15 miles. On other days we would travel all day long, and we would turn around and we could still see the camp where we had stayed the night before. We just didn't make any progress on some days. River crossings, we crossed one river after another one day, and I thought we would never be finished, and then Father informed me that we had crossed the same river 24 times. And I thought, what a ridiculous thing to do. Of course, I didn't understand that the river wound around and we had to keep crossing and crossing as the trail went. We would start each day well before dawn, and dawn in the summertime is around 5 a.m. So we would start each day at about 4, make the fires, cook breakfast, cook lunch, pack up the wagons, load everything up, and we would be on the trail by the time the sun came up. We'd stop very briefly for lunch, and then we'd keep going until about 7 o'clock in the evening, when we'd have to find a good place to camp. And we needed fresh water, we needed good grass, and we needed someplace safe from Indian attack. That was a major concern of ours all the time. Well, there were thousands of people crossing the plains at that time, and the animals that they brought with them had eaten the grass down to absolutely nothing. And so sometimes, in order to find a good camp, you would have to travel several miles in either direction off the trail to find enough grass for your animals to graze on that night. We would have campfires, we would have stories, we'd sing songs, and we'd play games. And it was usually a very enjoyable time in the evenings. But one night I was running around playing. I was only 7, and I stumbled and I fell into the campfire. And girls never dressed the way these young ladies are dressed. We wore 7 layers of clothing. We had stockings and bloomers and petticoats and skirts and aprons, and I fell into the fire and I went up in flames. And someone told me earlier, a very smart young lady told me something that you children learn now. When you're on fire, what do you learn?
Stop, drop, and roll.
Stop, drop, and roll. Well, we didn't know such a thing. I ran. I was trying to run away from the fire, and it followed me everywhere I went. And someone finally had a blanket and they threw it over me, and I fell to the ground, and they put the fire out. Someone else went for help, but help was several days away in another wagon train. So I was given laudanum for pain, and I was stuffed into the back of the wagon, and that was my treatment. The doctor came and he couldn't do any more for me. We stayed for a day or two to let me rest, and then we had to continue on our way. And every bump, every rock, every pothole in that trail with my fresh burns on my hip was excruciatingly painful. And I think it was a spur for me to try to get well quickly. At some point I regained my strength. I was able to start walking again a little more every day. And by the end of the trip I was walking with a limp and with a cane, but I was still moving on my own. I had gotten my new shoes at the beginning of the trip, but I outgrew them about halfway through, so I finished our trip in bare feet, but I still finished. I will never forget two places in particular. One of them is called Independence Rock. Do you know where Independence Rock is?
Heard of it.
Have you? Do you have any idea where it is? It's in a place that's now called Wyoming. And Wyoming was our halfway point. We needed to get to Independence Rock by a particular date. Can you guess? Independence Rock by the 4th of July, which is Independence Day. And the reason we had to get there by the 4th of July was to give us some kind of assurance that we might make it over the Sierra Nevada mountains before the snow flew. Not a guarantee, but it was a good goal to set. And we made it with a day or two to spare. And we had a little bit of time to stop and read the names and dates and inscriptions that were written on the rock. People were sending messages to each other on that rock. It was very fun to read. Words of encouragement, little tips, things that we needed to look forward to. Well, the other place I'll never forget was called the 40-Mile Desert. And my father said something at the time that stayed with me the rest of my life. And I'll ask you to excuse my language. He said, "It may not be hell, but you certainly can see it from here." And he was very right. That place in my mind has always been the physical embodiment of what I assume hell might be like. Not a blade of grass, not a drop of water. So we spent some time before heading into the desert to cut grass, to gather water, to give ourselves a little assurance that we would make it through. And even with all of our preparation, we ran out of grass and we ran out of water, and we had to feed the oxen the hay right out of our mattresses to keep them going, to give them a little energy to keep pulling that wagon. But we finally made it, and now we had one last hurdle, and that was the Sierra Nevada mountains. Now we had heard stories of ill-fated wagon train parties trying to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains. And one in particular that we had heard about that sent a shiver of terror through our bones was the Donner Party. And if you know of the Donner Party, you know the fate that waited for them in the mountains. We were very fortunate. We made it before the snow. We did have to work very hard to get over. The wagons would be hitched up with rope and chain, and it would be run up the side of the mountain, and they'd find a big tree and they'd wrap it around the tree. We'd empty the wagons entirely to make them lighter. We'd carry all of our belongings over the mountains in our arms. Well, children carried a few things. The men worked very hard. And a group of men would pull on the ropes and chain, and another group of men would push the wagon from behind, and you would hope that you made it over. And then to get down the other side, they would run chain through the wagon wheels to lock them, and the animals would literally drag the wagons down the mountain. Now, something very exciting happened in those mountains, though. My mother gave birth to my baby sister. And as a child, I just thought this was such a fun thing to have happen. As an adult who's had children now of my own, I realize what my mother and many, many, many other women went through on that trail. Walking all those miles, doing all that physical labor and expecting a child, usually tending to another small child. I just can't even imagine what they went through. We finally made it to California. We didn't lose one member of our party. My father was exceedingly proud of that feat. He did drag us back and forth across the West a few more times. And when I was 18, I moved to Missoula, and I married that gentleman over there, Frank Woody, the first mayor of Missoula, and I never moved again. For 45 years, I planted myself in Missoula. I stayed put, and I was not interested in ever moving again. But we had a very good life. We had 9 children. We were married for 45 years, and we are both buried right here. These are some of our children that are buried here with us. And we're buried right here. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
thank you for this lovely day. It's not freezing cold out.
I just listening to you, I felt like I was there with you.